The studio head placed a $50 million contract on the mahogany table, leaned back in his leather chair, and smiled like a man who'd never heard the word no. Then Clint Eastwood looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, and everything changed. Nobody spoke for 3 minutes after Clint Eastwood walked out of the Paramount boardroom, leaving behind the biggest film deal of 1985. The silence wasn't shock. It was something deeper. 75 people had just witnessed what happens when integrity costs $50 million, and the man with the power to take it chooses to walk away instead. It had started 6 months earlier with a phone call that should have been simple. Michael Rothberg, Paramount's head of production, had been chasing Clint for 2 years. Not for acting, though that was always on the table, but for directing. Rothberg had seen what Clint did with Unforgiven's early scripts, how he took material other directors couldn't crack and turned it into something that mattered. The project Rothberg wanted to discuss was different, bigger. A war epic with the kind of scope and budget that could define careers and fill theaters for months. The initial budget discussion started at $35 million, but by the time lawyers got involved, they were talking $50 million plus profit participation that could double that number. "This is the film that makes you Spielberg," Rothberg told Clint during their first meeting at the Beverly Hills Hotel. "Epic scope, human story, awards potential, and box office gold." Clint listened quietly, the way he always listened, giving nothing away in his expression. The project had merit. A World War II story following 3 interconnected battles across Europe, focusing on the ordinary soldiers rather than the generals. It was ambitious, well-researched, and exactly the kind of film Clint had been wanting to make. "Send me the complete script," Clint said. "All drafts, and the full production breakdown." 3 weeks later, the materials arrived at Clint's Malpaso Productions office. The script was solid, better than solid. The production breakdown was thorough, professional. Exactly what he'd expect from a major studio project. Everything looked right, except for one detail buried on page 40. 7 of the production notes. The film would be shot primarily in the Czech Republic to save costs. The local crew would be supplemented by a small corps of American department heads. Standard practice for international productions. Nothing unusual there. What caught Clint's attention was a single line about local accommodations and per diem rates for international cast and crew. The numbers were wrong, dramatically wrong. The American crew was budgeted for comfortable hotels and substantial daily expenses. The Czech crew, doing identical work, often with more experience in their own country, was budgeted for basic lodging and meal allowances that wouldn't cover lunch at the hotels where the Americans would stay. It was legal. It was standard practice. It was also wrong. Clint called the production manager directly. "These per diem rates," Clint said without preamble. "Czech crew versus American crew. Explain the difference." "Standard international scale," came the reply. "Different cost of living, different union agreements. Been doing it this way for 20 years. "Samey work?" Clint asked. "Well, yes, but samey hours. Generally, but the local rates are competitive for." "Thank you," Clint said, and hung up. For 2 weeks, Clint said nothing to Rothberg or Paramount. He just thought the film itself was good. The script honored the subject matter, the budget was realistic, except for this disparity. Everything else about the project aligned with his values. But this one thing didn't. The formal contract meeting was scheduled for the 15th of November in Paramount's executive conference room. Rothberg had invited key department heads, the studio's legal team, and 2 senior executives who'd flown in from New York specifically for this signing. The conference room was impressive in the way studio conference rooms were designed to be impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lot. Mahogany table that seated 20. Leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The walls displayed posters from Paramount's biggest successes, a not-so-subtle reminder of what association with the studio could mean. Clint arrived precisely on time, carrying only a single folder, No entourage, no agent, no lawyer. Just him and the contract he'd reviewed 3 times. Rothberg greeted him enthusiastically, introducing him to executives whose names and titles blurred together in the practice choreography of Hollywood deal, making everyone was animated, energetic, already talking about the film as if it were finished. "Gentlemen," Rothberg announced to the room once everyone was seated, "we're here to make movie history." The contract itself was straightforward. $50 million budget, creative control for Clint, profit participation that could generate enormous returns. Everything they'd discussed, everything he'd asked for, laid out in clear legal language. Rothberg placed the contract in front of Clint, with the flourish of a man who just won something significant. "This is the biggest directing deal we've offered anyone this year," Rothberg said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never had a $50 million offer refused. "Full creative control, final cut profit participation that starts from $1, everything we discussed." Clint opened the contract and began reading. Not scanning, reading, line by line, page by page, while 12 people watched and waited. On page 18, he found what he was looking for: the production budget breakdown, including crew compensation. The same disparity he'd noticed in the initial materials, now formalized in the contract. American department heads, $400 per Dalton Y, per diem plus first. Class hotels, check crew, $40 per Dalton Y per diem plus basic accommodations. Samey work, same hours, same contribution to the film, different respect. Clint closed the contract and looked across the table at Rothberg. "The check crew compensation," Clint said quietly. "It is inadequate." Rothberg blinked, thrown off by the unexpected topic. This wasn't about money or creative control or any of the usual contract sticking points. "I am sorry," Rothberg said. "The per diem rates for the check crew. They're doing the same work as the American crew. The compensation gap is unreasonable." The room shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how these meetings usually went. Contracts this size had been negotiated for months. Details like crew compensation were administrative matters, handled by production managers and accountants. "Clint," Rothberg said, his tone patient but slightly condescending, "those are standard international rates. The cost of living in Prague is different than Los Angeles. The local crew expects these rates. It is how the industry works overseas." "The work is the same," Clint replied. "The hours are the same. The expertise required is the same." One of the New York executives leaned forward. "Mr. Eastwood, we appreciate your concern for the crew, but these budget allocations have been carefully calculated. Adjusting crew compensation would require restructuring the entire production budget." "Then restructure it," Clint said simply. Silence fell over the room. 12 people stared at Clint, processing what they'd just heard. He was willing to hold up a $50 million deal over per diem rates for check crew members. Rothberg recovered first, forcing a laugh. "Clint, we're talking about maybe 30 crew positions. The difference in total budget would be, what, maybe $200,000 over the entire production? That is a rounding error on a project this size." "Then it shouldn't be a problem to fix it," Clint said. The legal team exchanged glances. The executives whispered among themselves. Rothberg's confident smile was beginning to strain. "Look," Rothberg said, his voice taking on an edge now. "I understand the sentiment, but we have stockholders to answer to. We have budget parameters that have already been approved by the board. We can't just arbitrarily increase costs because it is the right thing to do," Clint interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying more weight now. "Because it is not how the industry works," Rothberg finished. "These are standard practices established over decades. Every studio operates this way. You change these rates for one production. It sets precedents that affect every other international project." Clint sat back in his chair, studying the faces around the table. 12 successful people, each earning more in a year than most people saw in a lifetime, explaining why they couldn't afford to pay check workers fairly for work they desperately needed done. "So your position," Clint said slowly, "is that you need these people to make your movie, but you don't need to respect them while they make it." That is not what I said, Rothberg began. It is what you meant, Clint replied. The room went quiet again outside the conference room windows. The Paramount lot continued its daily business, golf carts carrying executives between sound stages, crews setting up for afternoon shoots, the routine machinery of entertainment capitalism grinding forward. Clint, one of the New York executives, said, his tone taking on the forced patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. This is a $50 million project. Your fee alone is more than most films' entire budgets. The profit participation could net you another $50 million if the film performs. We're talking about transforming your career, cementing your legacy, and you want to hold up this entire deal over meal allowances for Czech electricians? Clint looked at the executive for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even quieter than before. Those Czech electricians will work 16-hour days in the rain to make this film look perfect. They'll miss time with their families, ignore their own projects, dedicate months of their lives to making our vision real. And your position is that their dedication is worth $40 a day, while ours is worth thousands. It is not about worth, Rothberg said quickly. It is about market rates, industry standards. It is about respect, Clint interrupted. Or the lack of it. He stood up slowly, his 6'4" frame unfolding from the leather chair. The movement was deliberate, controlled, but it changed the entire dynamic of the room. Suddenly, everyone else felt smaller. You are making this more complicated than it needs to be, Rothberg said, standing as well, trying to reclaim some authority in the conversation. This is how business works. This is how films get made. You want to be idealistic about crew rates, make a documentary. You want to make a $50 million war epic. You work within industry standards. Clint picked up the contract, all 47 pages of it. He held it for a moment, the weight of $50 million in career transformation balanced in his hands. Industry standards, he repeated quietly. Exactly, Rothberg said, sensing victory. Industry standards that have worked for. Clint looked directly at Rothberg, and for exactly 3 seconds, said nothing. Just looked at him with the same quiet intensity that had made the man with no name legendary. In those 3 seconds, everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had just shifted. This wasn't negotiation anymore. This wasn't business as usual. This was a man making a decision about who he was willing to be. Gentlemen, Clint said, his voice carrying the finality of a closing door. I don't work with people who don't respect the people they need. He set the contract back on the table, unopened and unsigned. Thank you for your time, he said, and walked toward the door. The room erupted. Voices overlapping, executives talking over each other, everyone suddenly trying to solve a problem they hadn't realized existed 5 minutes earlier. Wait, let's talk about this. We can revisit the crew compensation. Don't make a career mistake over a philosophical difference. $50 million, Clint. But Clint was already at the door. He paused, his hand on the handle, and looked back at the room full of people who couldn't understand why someone would walk away from $50 million over principle. The film will get made, he said quietly. Someone else will direct it. And those Czech crew members will still get $40 a day while the people making decisions get rich off their work. That is the real movie being made here. He opened the door and walked out. The conference room fell silent again. 12 people sat staring at the unsigned contract on the mahogany table, trying to process what had just happened. Rothberg sank into his chair, his face pale. $50 million had just walked out of his life because he wouldn't budget an extra $200,000 for crew respect. The New York executives were whispering urgently into phones, probably explaining to boards and stockholders how a sure thing had suddenly disappeared. The legal team was already discussing damage control, wondering if there was a way to salvage the deal, but everyone in that room knew the truth. Clint Eastwood had drawn a line in the sand, and they had chosen to stand on the wrong side of it. The film eventually got made with a different director. It was competent, professional, and forgettable. It made money but never mattered to anyone. Clint went on to direct other films, Smaller budgets, but bigger impacts. Stories that honored the people who made them, both in front of and behind the camera. And Rothberg learned that some people value their integrity more than their net worth. Years later, in an interview, Clint was asked about walking away from the Paramount deal. His answer was characteristic. Money doesn't change who you are. It just reveals it. The reporter pressed for details about the specific contract disagreement. Some deals cost too much, Clint said. Not in money, in self-respect. But those who were in that conference room remember something more specific. They remember 3 seconds of silence that said more than any speech about values, integrity, and the price of doing business the right way. They remember a man who proved that real power isn't the ability to take whatever's offered. It is the strength to walk away when what is offered costs too much of who you are.